Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight we find ourselves stepping away from the grand narratives of pharaohs and pyramids, away from the glittering halls of Olympus and the divine dramas that shaped the ancient world. Instead, we descend into something far more intimate and far more human. We step into the homes, the fields, the very breath and bones of those upon whose labor the entire civilization of ancient Egypt was built. These were the peasants, the fellahin, the countless millions whose names we will never know, whose faces we will never see clearly, yet without whom Egypt would have been nothing more than sand and stone. When we think of ancient Egypt, our minds conjure images of colossal pyramids rising impossibly against blue skies, of pharaohs draped in gold and linen, of gods with animal heads guiding the affairs of mortals. But beneath these monuments, beneath the temples and the tombs, beneath the careful records kept by scribes on papyrus, there existed an entire civilization of common people. They were farmers, laborers, mothers, children. They woke before dawn, worked until their muscles screamed, ate simple bread when there was enough, and worried about things eternal and immediate all at once. They feared the gods, feared famine, feared their landlords, and feared death without proper burial, for without their bodies preserved and their names remembered, they believed their souls would wander the darkness forever. The peasants of Egypt were not slaves, at least not in the formal sense that we think of slavery. Yet they were bound to the land with iron chains woven from necessity and law. They could not leave their villages without permission. They owned nothing, not the house they lived in, not the fields they worked, not even their own children fully. Everything belonged to the pharaoh, who generously granted portions of it to nobles, priests, and officials. The peasant was a servant in the truest sense. His common greeting was not "good morning," but rather, "let us work for the noble." This greeting was more than politeness. It was an acknowledgement of his place in a world that had already decided his fate before he was born. Yet despite the hardship, despite the relentless toil and the narrow confines of his existence, the Egyptian peasant endured. He celebrated festivals with drink and music. He loved his family. He believed in the gods and sought their favor through amulets and spells. He hoped somehow that after death, his soul would find peace in a paradise called the Field of Reeds, where he could finally rest, where the burden of endless labor might at last be lifted. This is his story. This is what life truly looked like for the millions who built Egypt with their hands and their sweat, and their hope against hope that it would all mean something in the end. To understand the life of an Egyptian peasant is to first understand the Nile River, for every moment of his existence was dictated by its moods and its cycles. The Nile was not merely a river. It was the heartbeat of civilization, the giver of life, the destroyer of hope, the keeper of time itself. Without it, Egypt would be nothing but endless desert, a wasteland where nothing green could grow and no human could survive. With it, the narrow valley and delta became one of the most fertile regions on earth, a paradox of abundance born from water in the middle of desolation. The ancient Egyptians divided their year not into the 4 seasons that we know, but into 3, each defined by the Nile's movement and temperament. The first was Akhet, the inundation season, also called the season of flooding. It began in late summer, around July or August, when waters from the highlands of Ethiopia swelled the Nile and sent it surging across its banks. The peasant could not control this flood. He could only watch and pray that it would be neither too weak nor too strong, for the river knew neither mercy nor restraint. When the waters rose properly, they brought with them a gift of incalculable value, silt the rich, dark sediment that accumulated during the journey downriver, carrying nutrients that made the soil extraordinarily fertile. Imagine standing in your small mud brick village during Akhet, watching the waters creep closer and closer to your home, spreading across the fields like a vast inland sea. The entire landscape vanished beneath water. The boundaries between fields became invisible. Everything was water, 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 stretching to the horizon. The peasants' fields became nothing but a continuation of the river, and for 4 months the land would remain largely underwater, waiting, gestation, preparing itself for renewal. This season, from roughly late July through early November, could be terrifying or wonderful, depending on the volume of water. The priests and scribes kept careful records of the Nile's height, using nilometers, structures built along the riverbanks that measured the rising and falling of water levels. A good flood brought prosperity. A weak flood meant starvation. A catastrophic flood meant devastation. During Akhet, the peasant could not work his fields. There was nothing to plant, nothing to cultivate. The land was not his to command during these months. So what did he do? This is where the system of taxation and obligation became brutally clever. Since the peasant could not pay his taxes in crops, the crops did not exist yet. He paid with his labor. The state called upon him during the inundation season to perform corvée labor, also called forced labor. He might be conscripted to work on grand building projects, to quarry stone, to dig and maintain the canals and dikes that controlled the floodwaters, to prepare fields for the coming season, or to work on whatever other enterprise the nobles and the pharaoh deemed important. Some sources suggest that the Great Pyramids themselves were built during these seasons, when peasants from all across Egypt were gathered together and put to work, constructing monuments to eternity that they themselves would never see completed in their lifetimes. This labor was not optional. If a peasant refused or tried to hide, officials would hunt him down. Sometimes they would take family members as hostages until the man reported for duty. Sometimes they would beat him with whips. The system was cruel and efficient, designed to extract every possible ounce of labor from those at the bottom of society. Some wealthier peasants, if such a category could truly be said to exist, might pay someone else to do their corvée duty in their stead. But for most, there was no choice. You worked or you faced punishment. The second season was Péré, the season of emergence, running roughly from November to the end of March. As the floodwaters receded, they left behind something magnificent. The land was damp and black, covered with the nutrient-rich silt that had travelled down from Ethiopia. This was the most precious gift the Nile could give. Within weeks, the ground would be firm enough to walk on without sinking into mud. The peasant knew that this was his moment. During Péré, there was no time for rest. This was the growing season, the season of work that demanded everything a man had to give. The peasant would plough his assigned field, using a wooden plough pulled by oxen, cattle, or donkeys, if he was fortunate enough to have access to such animals. Many peasants did not and had to pull the plough themselves, working with other villagers in a rotation where they shared what few animals the community possessed. The plough functioned to break up the soil, to turn the earth, to create furrows where seeds could be placed. After ploughing came hoeing, back-breaking, relentless hoeing with short-handled wooden tools. A peasant might spend entire days bent over at the waist, breaking up clumps of earth, removing stones, loosening the ground so that seeds could penetrate and roots could grow. These hoes had short handles not out of any design preference, but because wood was scarce and expensive in Egypt. A longer handle would require more wood, and the scribes who oversaw the work did not authorize such wasteful expenditures. So the peasant crouched and hoed, his back screaming, his hands blistering, day after day after day. Once the field was prepared, came the sowing. Seeds of emmer wheat, barley, chickpeas, lentils, onions, garlic, lettuce. These were scattered across the fertile earth. The peasant or his family would walk through the fields, casting seeds by hand, the motion rhythmic and repetitive. There was something almost meditative about it, if one could ignore the hunger in one's belly and the fear of crop failure that was never far from the peasant's mind. The seeds would germinate in the warm soil, and within days green shoots would push through, tiny promises of survival. During Pered, the peasant also tended these growing crops, keeping them free of weeds, watching for the first signs of disease or insect damage, praying to the gods to send rain and to keep the locusts away. The women of the household would often work the small private gardens that peasant families were allowed to maintain beside their homes, growing vegetables for their own consumption. These gardens were precious, not because they produced much, but because what they produced belonged to the family and not to their landlords. The third season was Shemu, the harvest, lasting from roughly the end of March through late May. This was the culmination, the moment toward which all of Pered's labor had been directed. The crops had grown tall and golden. The wheat and barley were ready. The legumes had matured. Now came the harvest, perhaps the most physically demanding season of all. The peasant, working alongside his family and neighbors, would move through the fields with a sickle, a tool consisting of a short handle and a crescent-shaped blade. He would grasp the grain just below the head and slice it off, moving in a rhythmic pattern, careful not to waste a single kernel. The cut grain would be laid on the ground in rows, left there briefly to dry, then gathered and bundled. These bundles would be loaded onto donkeys or carried to a threshing floor. The threshing was grueling work. The bundles of grain would be spread on the threshing floor, and either animals would be driven over them to separate the grain from the chaff, or peasants with flails would beat them repeatedly. The dust was incredible, filling the air and the lungs, making it almost impossible to breathe. Once the grain was beaten free of its chaff, it would be winnowed, tossed in the air using wooden forks so that the wind would carry away the lighter chaff, while the heavier grain fell back down to be caught in baskets. This work went on for weeks throughout Shemu, as the entire crop had to be processed, measured, recorded, and stored. The irony and the injustice of this system lay in what happened next. The peasant had worked all year. He had endured the waiting and the uncertainty of Akhet, the exhausting labor of Pered, and the back-breaking work of Shemu. The crop was now ready, but the crop was not his. The majority of it, as much as 70 to 90% in some cases, belonged to the landowner, the pharaoh, a noble, or the priests of a temple. The peasant would be allowed to keep only enough to feed himself and his family until the next harvest, along with enough seeds to plant for the coming year. Any surplus beyond this amount of his small portion would be taxed away, paid to the state in the form of additional corvée labor or in other forms of tribute. It was a system designed to extract maximum value from the peasant while allowing him just enough to survive. He was never meant to accumulate wealth, never meant to rise above his station, never meant to own the fruits of his labor. He was a tool, like the plow or the hoe, to be used by the miel, state, and discarded when he could no longer work. The peasant's home was a modest structure, as simple and as functional as anything built by human hands could be. It was constructed from mud brick, that most essential building material of ancient Egypt. To make mud brick, workers would gather mud from the banks of the Nile or from canals, mixing it with straw and sand to give it strength and prevent excessive cracking. This mixture would then be pressed into wooden molds, left in the sun to dry until it was hard enough to handle, and then built into walls. The process was straightforward and required no specialized skills or materials beyond what the environment itself provided. A typical peasant's house might consist of 3 or 4 rooms, though poorer peasants might have only 2. The rooms would not have much in the way of internal divisions. Doors were small and could be closed, but windows were usually small openings high in the walls designed to let in light, while keeping out the worst of the heat and dust. The walls were not very thick, often just a single brick in width, which made them quick to build but also less durable. Over time, the mud bricks would begin to deteriorate. Rain was rare in most of Egypt, but when it came, it could be devastating to mud brick structures. The roofs, most commonly flat, were made of wooden beams covered with reeds or palm thatch, providing shelter but not much insulation from the intense heat. The focal point of any peasant home was the kitchen, which would contain an oven for baking bread and a millstone for grinding grain into flour. These were not rooms set apart as they are in modern homes, but rather spaces within the larger structure where cooking and food preparation occurred. The oven was often made from clay and would be fired with whatever fuel could be found: dried animal dung, reeds, straw, or scraps of wood. The smoke from the oven would typically vent through an opening in the roof rather than through a proper chimney, filling the interior of the home with smoke and the smell of cooking. Inside the home, furnishings were sparse. A typical peasant might own a few wooden stools or benches, perhaps a simple wooden table, and a raised bed made of wood or woven reeds. Sleeping arrangements were often communal. Several family members might share a single bed, especially in winter, when warmth was necessary. During the hot summer months, many peasants would sleep on the flat roof of their homes, seeking the cooler night air. The floors were usually made of packed earth, sometimes covered with reed mats that provided a layer of insulation and a softer surface for walking and sitting. The walls might be painted with simple whitewash or decorated with colored linen in the homes of slightly wealthier peasants, but most would be left plain. There would be few decorations, perhaps a few pottery vessels hanging on walls or sitting on shelves. These vessels served practical purposes, storing grain, water, oil, and other necessities, but they might also have been made with some aesthetic consideration. The Egyptian love of beauty and order manifested even in the homes of the poorest people, though necessarily in modest forms. Many peasant villages were built near the Nile, close to the agricultural fields where they worked, sometimes on raised ground to avoid flooding during Akhet. The houses would be clustered together, creating small communities where families lived in close proximity to one another. The villages might have a small shrine or chapel dedicated to a local deity, and there would certainly be communal spaces where people gathered to socialize, dispute, and conduct business. Within the home, the family structure was patriarchal, with the father as the head of the household, with final authority over all decisions. Yet women held significant legal rights that would have been the envy of women in many other ancient societies. A peasant woman could own property, could conduct business transactions, could sue and be sued in court, and could initiate divorce proceedings if her husband treated her badly. In practice, however, social pressure and custom often limited women's freedom to exercise these rights. Most peasant women spent their lives in the home and in the immediate vicinity of their village, working and bearing children. Marriage in peasant society was usually arranged by parents, designed to create advantageous family connections and to ensure that both parties were of suitable character. The ideal marriage age for girls was sometime between 15 and 18, while boys typically married between 18 and 20. The ceremonies marking marriage were not elaborate affairs for peasants, lacking the formality and expense of elite marriages, but they were nevertheless important social events that bound families together. Once married, a woman would typically move into her husband's household or into a shared family home where multiple generations lived together. The purpose of marriage was understood to be primarily the production of children. An Egyptian proverb advised a man to take a wife while you are young, that she may bear children for you. Children were viewed as gifts from the gods and as essential to the continuation of the family and the perpetuation of religious obligations after death. Peasant families might have anywhere from 4 to 8 children, though many of these children would not survive to adulthood. Infant mortality was extraordinarily high, with perhaps 30 to 40% of children dying before the age of 5. A woman who survived to adulthood might expect to live into her late 20s or early 30s on average, and this expectation was considerably shortened by the complications of repeated pregnancies and childbirth. Childbirth was a perilous event, attended usually by midwives rather than physicians. The mother would squat on a special berth, stool, often made of stone or wood, while attendants held her steady and encouraged her. If the labor was difficult or prolonged, there was little that could be done beyond prayer and the administration of herbal remedies. Many women died in childbirth or from infections in the days following delivery. Those who survived and managed to keep their children alive faced the exhausting work of nursing and raising them with few resources and much physical labor. Children in peasant families had responsibilities from an early age. Once weaned, usually around 3 years old, they would begin to learn the skills necessary for adult life. Young boys would follow their fathers into the fields, initially carrying out simple tasks, holding animals, gathering firewood, fetching water, and gradually taking on more skilled work as they grew older and stronger. Young girls would work alongside their mothers in the home and in the gardens, learning cooking, textile production, water fetching, and all of the myriad tasks necessary to maintain a household. By adolescence, a peasant child would be essentially a full-fledged worker, and by the late teenage years, both sons and daughters would be expected to marry and start their own families. Play was not forbidden to children, and archaeological evidence suggests that children had toys and games, simple dolls made from clay or rags, wooden balls, and games similar to hopscotch or wrestling games played with other children. But childhood was brief and work was constant. There was little time for extended periods of unstructured play in a peasant's life. The family depended on the labor of every member, young and old, and childhood was understood as a period of preparation for the work that would consume the rest of one's life. The daily routine in a peasant home would begin before dawn. The mother would rise first, if she had not slept on the roof and needed to descend to the kitchen, or she would wake others who had spent the night inside. She would prepare the morning meal, bread, perhaps with some beer or milk, maybe a few onions or garlic if available. The father and older sons would eat quickly and head out to the fields or to whatever labor assignment awaited them that day. The mother would oversee the younger children and the household, perhaps spending time at the communal well gathering water, washing clothes by pounding them against stones in the river or canal, preparing the midday meal, tending to the small garden if the season permitted, and performing various domestic manufacturing tasks. The Egyptian peasant household was relatively self-sufficient in many ways. Women spun flax fibre into thread and wove it on looms to create linen cloth. They made pottery, though this was often done at the communal level by specialists. They brewed beer, a process that was so important to the Egyptian diet that it might better be understood as a form of food production than as the creation of an intoxicating beverage. Egyptian beer was thick, nutritious, and low in alcohol content, quite different from modern beers. They preserved food using salt and drying. They gathered wild plants and prepared them for consumption. All of this work was done with minimal tools and maximum labor. By mid-afternoon, the mother might prepare a more substantial meal to be eaten later. In peasant households, this would typically be bread with vegetables, onions, garlic, lettuce, if in season, and possibly a fish if the family lived near enough to the river to have access to fish. The whole family would eat together when the father and working sons returned from the fields, sitting either on stools or on the ground, eating with their fingers from communal dishes. Water would be drunk with the meal, perhaps with beer for the men. Bathing was important to Egyptians of all classes, and peasant families would bathe in the Nile or in canals if they were fortunate enough to live near them. They used a soap paste made from animal fat and chalk, and cleanliness was maintained as well as circumstances permitted. In the evening, after work was done, there might be a bit of time for rest and socializing. Family members might sit together in front of the home or on the roof, talking, working on simple crafts, or listening to stories. An older family member might tell tales of the gods, of family history, of clever tricks and moral lessons. These stories serve both to entertain and to transmit cultural values and practical knowledge from one generation to the next. For the most part, however, life was an endless cycle of work, with little time for leisure except on feast days and festivals. To understand the life of a peasant is to understand labor in its most fundamental and relentless form. The peasant did not work 8 hours a day. He worked from dawn to dusk, every day, with only brief respites for meals. His entire existence was organized around work. There was no separation between work and life, no private time away from his obligations, no vacation, no retirement. At some point, when his body could no longer sustain the physical demands placed upon it, he would die. That was the only retirement available to him. The primary work of the peasant was agriculture, and the tools he used to accomplish this work were simple and had changed little for generations. The plough was the fundamental implement, a wooden frame with a blade that cut and turned the soil. Some ploughs had bronze tips, but these were relatively rare and reserved for use on lands owned by the wealthy or the temples. The hoe was nearly universal, a simple tool with a blade set at a right angle to a long handle, designed for breaking up soil and removing weeds. The sickle was used at harvest time, its crescent-shaped blade designed to cut grain efficiently. There were also forks, rakes, baskets of various sizes for carrying and winnowing, and grinding stones for processing grain. Beyond these basic tools, the peasant's work often required no equipment at all beyond his own body. He would pull ploughs when animals were not available. He would carry stones, water, or grain on his back, or balanced on his head. He would dig ditches and canals with a simple spade. He would do whatever work was assigned to him by the officials who controlled the corvée labor system. During the growing season, work in the fields never truly ceased. The crops needed constant attention. Weeds had to be removed, sometimes multiple times as they regrew. Fields had to be inspected regularly for signs of disease or insect damage. Water had to be directed to the plants through a careful system of canals and ditches. During periods of low water, the shaduf, a lever and pole device with a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other, would be used to lift water from the river or canals and pour it onto the fields. This work was exhausting, repetitive, and never-ending. A peasant operating a shaduf might do so for hours at a time, pulling down on one end to lift water, then easing it back down, over and over, the monotony broken only by the ache in his arms and back. The work was dangerous, though this danger was often not taken seriously by those who assigned the work. A peasant might drown while working in fields submerged by floodwaters. He might be bitten by a crocodile or a snake while wading through water. He might suffer from heat exhaustion or heat stroke during the intense heat of late spring. The tools themselves, though simple, could cause injury. A sickle blade could cut deep into a hand or leg. A hoe could strike a foot or shin. There was no workers' compensation for injuries, no medical care beyond folk remedies and prayer, no disability payments if a peasant became too injured to work. An injury was often effectively a death sentence, because an unable peasant could not work, and a peasant who could not work was not allowed to eat. Tax collection happened multiple times per year, and the process of tax collection gave rise to another form of labor, the labor of revolt and punishment. When taxes were due, officials would come to the villages and oversee the harvest of grain, measuring it carefully and taking the state's portion. If a peasant had not produced enough to pay his taxes, if his portion was deemed insufficient, he faced consequences. Sometimes he would be beaten with a courbash, a type of whip, to encourage him to pay. Sometimes he would be arrested and forced into labor gangs. Sometimes his family members would be taken hostage until he paid. The fear and humiliation of the tax collection process was a constant feature of peasant life. Beyond agricultural work, peasants could be conscripted for other labor projects. The construction of temples, the building of pyramids, the excavation of canals, the quarrying of stone, all of these required enormous amounts of labor. The evidence suggests that these projects were staffed not primarily by slaves, as popular imagination suggests, but by conscripted peasants working their corvée duties. During the inundation season, when fields were flooded and agricultural work was impossible, the state could gather peasants from across Egypt and put them to work on massive construction projects. These labor forces were organized with remarkable efficiency. Workers would be divided into gangs, each with a foreman. The gangs would have names, friends of the pharaoh, or similar honorifics that were presumably meant to make the forced labor feel like a privilege. Records survive of workers receiving rations of bread and beer while engaged in these projects, suggesting that at least the state recognized an obligation to feed those it conscripted. Graffiti left by ancient workers has been found on the walls of temples and monuments, marks made by workers identifying themselves and their gang, sometimes insulting the overseer, sometimes expressing pride in their work. Work schedules were brutal. A day might begin before dawn and continue until late afternoon, with only brief breaks for meals and water. In the heat of the summer, work sometimes continued well into the evening, taking advantage of the slightly cooler temperatures after the sun began to set. The human body is capable of remarkable endurance, and the ancient Egyptians seemed to understand this, pushing their workers to the absolute limit of what human physicality could sustain. The skilled craftsmen, the stoneworkers, the stonemasons, the sculptors, had somewhat higher status than agricultural labourers, but they too worked under similar constraints and with similar lack of autonomy. A craftsman's work might be slightly more valued than that of a field labourer, and he might receive slightly better rations or have slightly more comfortable accommodations, but he was still bound to his work by the same obligations and the same threats. Craftsmen often worked in family groups, with skills passed down from father to son, but they could not choose to leave their profession or to stop working without permission. The only occupation that offered any possibility of escaping the peasant's lot was that of the scribe. Scribes were trained in the complex writing systems, both the formal hieroglyphic script and the more cursive hieratic script, and they served as the intermediaries between the common people and the state. A scribe kept records of tax payments, recorded workers' names and assignments, tracked the distribution of rations, and handled the vast administrative apparatus that kept Egypt running. Scribes were typically recruited from families of scribes, educated from childhood in the difficult art of writing, which required memorizing hundreds of hieroglyphic signs and understanding the complex rules of Egyptian writing. A scribe could escape the hardest labor. He would not spend his days bending over a hoe or hauling water. Instead, he would spend them recording what others did, yet even scribes were not truly free. They served the state and were expected to produce accurate records and to enforce the will of their superiors. One instruction letter to a young scribe named Wenem Diaman, written by a high official, describes the peasant's situation in comparison. Let me also expound to you the situation of the peasant. That other tough occupation. Comes the inundation and soaks him. He attends to his equipment. By day, he cuts his farming tools. By night, he twists rope. The implication was clear. The scribe should be grateful for his position, because the alternative was peasant labor, which was nearly unbearable. The Egyptian peasant's diet was remarkable primarily for its monotony and its constant insufficiency. For the vast majority of peasants, the diet consisted of bread, beer, and vegetables, with meat being a luxury reserved for festivals and special occasions. Some sources suggest that the average peasant might eat meat only once or twice per year, while the wealthier could afford meat regularly. Fish was more commonly available to peasants living near the Nile, and fish formed a significant part of the diet for those with access to it. Bread was the dietary staple, the foundation upon which all nutrition was built. Bread came from grain, emmer wheat or barley, which were the two primary crops cultivated in Egypt. The grain would be ground into flour using a grinding stone, a process that was enormously labor-intensive. A woman grinding grain using a round stone on another stone surface might grind for hours each day, producing enough flour for her family's bread. The flour was then mixed with water, sometimes with the addition of salt or other flavorings like coriander, and allowed to rise using a yeast starter maintained from batch to batch. Once the dough had risen, it would be baked in an oven, producing bread. The bread itself would have been quite different from modern bread. It would have been denser, heavier, and would have had a somewhat coarse texture. The emmer wheat used in ancient Egypt contained more bran and chaff than modern wheat, and the milling process was less efficient at removing these elements. The result was bread that was higher in fiber and some minerals, but also more gritty. Tiny fragments of stone from the grinding process, or sand from the environment, might find their way into the bread. And over a lifetime of eating, the grains of sand would wear down the peasant's teeth, sometimes to the point where significant portions of the tooth were gone by adulthood. The quantity of bread consumed was substantial. Estimates suggest that peasants might eat a kilogram or more of bread per day, making it the source of the vast majority of their calories. A laborer engaged in heavy physical work might consume even more. Bread was so important to the Egyptian diet and to Egyptian life that workers were sometimes paid in bread rather than in coin. Bread and beer were listed in tomb inscriptions as the food most desired in the afterlife, suggesting their central importance to Egyptian consciousness. Beer was the other staple beverage and nutritional source. Egyptian beer was quite different from modern beer. It was typically thick, nutritious, and relatively low in alcohol content, more like a liquid food than an intoxicating drink. Beer was made from grain, often barley, and it was brewed by allowing grain to ferment, a process that created a mildly alcoholic, slightly sweet beverage. Beer was more sanitary than water in many parts of Egypt, particularly in the delta regions where water sources were often brackish or contaminated. The fermentation process would kill most pathogens, making beer safer to drink than untreated water. It is estimated that an Egyptian laborer might drink a liter or more of beer per day, making it a significant source of both calories and liquid hydration. Vegetables formed the third component of the peasant diet. Onions, garlic, lettuce, and other vegetables were cultivated in gardens or in small plots near homes, or they were foraged from wild plants in the areas surrounding settlements. Legumes, chickpeas and lentils, were also cultivated and provided a source of protein that supplemented the grain-based diet. These vegetables could be eaten raw or cooked, added to bread, or made into soups and stews. The availability of vegetables varied with the season. During the growing season, vegetables were more abundant. During the dry season after harvest, vegetable options were limited to what had been preserved through drying or storage. Fruit was available seasonally, particularly dates and figs, which could be dried and stored for later use. These were sweet and provided a relief from the monotony of bread and vegetables, and they were valued for this reason. Some peasants who lived near the Nile might have had access to other fruits, pomegranates, grapes, and melons. But for the majority of the peasant population, dates and dried figs were the closest they came to fruit. Meat, as mentioned, was rare. Poultry was somewhat more accessible than beef. A peasant might raise a few chickens, ducks, or geese near his home, and these could be eaten on special occasions, or, more likely, their eggs could be collected and eaten. Pigs were raised by some peasants, and pork was eaten, though religious beliefs about pork varied and changed over time. Beef was expensive and was consumed primarily by the wealthy, or on religious festival days when an animal might be sacrificed and the meat distributed to the community. Fish was important in the diet, particularly for peasants living in the delta or in villages near the Nile. The river and canals were full of fish, tilapia, catfish, mullet, and other species, and fishing was a common activity. Peasants might fish during their limited free time, and fish might also be part of rations given to workers. Fish could be salted and dried for preservation, making it available year-round. The nutritional impact of this diet was profound and devastating. The reliance on grain as the primary food source meant that peasants suffered from protein deficiency. They were not starving in the sense of getting no calories, but they were malnourished, lacking sufficient protein to maintain muscle mass and strength, lacking iron for healthy blood, lacking the variety of nutrients necessary for optimal health. The evidence from skeletal remains suggests that peasants were, on average, quite short. Men averaging around 159 centimeters, about 5 feet 2 inches, and women around 153 centimeters, about 5 feet. Stunted by poor nutrition during childhood and adulthood. Many suffered from anemia, a condition that would have caused fatigue and weakness, making their already difficult labor even more exhausting. Starvation was a real and recurring threat. If the Nile flood failed to produce adequate inundation, if the growing seasons saw disease or pests, if harvests were poor, the food supply could become critically low. In times of famine, peasants would eat food that would normally be considered unsuitable. Bitter wild plants, animals that would normally not be killed, seeds saved for planting. Historical records preserve accounts of famines so severe that people engaged in cannibalism or sold themselves and their families into slavery in exchange for food. Yet despite these privations, despite the hunger that was never far from any peasant's consciousness, despite the poor health and the short lives, the peasant continued. He had no choice. His body required sustenance, and sustenance was available, at least most of the time. He ate his bread, drank his beer, consumed his vegetables and rare portions of fish or meat, and continued with his work. The hunger, the weakness, the ache of an insufficiently nourished body, these became normal, part of the background of existence as much as the heat and the dust. The Egyptian peasant lived in a world populated by gods. Every tree, every rock, every canal and corner of the village had a divine presence. The gods were not distant or abstract concepts. They were intimate, immediate, and powerful. They controlled the flooding of the Nile, the success of harvests, the health of one's children, the fate of one's soul after death. To ignore the gods, or to fail to show proper respect and make proper offerings, was to invite disaster. Religion was not something one did on the Sabbath and then forgot about for the rest of the week. It was woven through every moment of existence. The great temples of Egypt were primarily the domain of the pharaoh and the priestly class. A peasant could not simply walk into a temple and worship as he pleased. The temples were closed to the common people, and access to the inner sanctums was restricted to the pharaoh and the highest priests. What the peasant could do was approach the temple during processions, when the statue of the god would be brought out and carried through the streets. During these processions, the peasant might catch a glimpse of the god, might experience a moment of direct connection to the divine, might even ask the god questions by writing them on fragments of pottery and casting them on the ground. The direction the divine bark moved, forward for yes, backward for no, would provide the god's answer. But for daily spiritual needs, the peasant relied on other forms of religion. He might maintain a small shrine in his home dedicated to a household god or goddess. Bes, a dwarf-like deity with a protective character, was particularly popular in peasant homes, as was Tawaret, a hippopotamus-headed goddess who protected women and children. Amulets were worn constantly. Small objects made from stone, faience, or other materials, carved in the shapes of gods or containing magical signs and symbols. These amulets were believed to provide protection against disease, accidents, and evil spirits. A peasant might wear several amulets, one for protection, one for fertility, one for safe childbirth, one for good fortune. Magic was deeply integrated with religion. Spells and incantations were used to invoke the power of the gods, to protect oneself and one's family, to curse one's enemies, or to ensure favorable outcomes. A love spell might threaten to set fire to sacred places if the gods did not grant the speaker the love of his desired woman. Childbirth was surrounded by protective magic, with spells designed to protect mother and child. A magical wand carved with images of household gods could be used to draw protective circles on the earthen floor around vulnerable family members. The peasant would have known the basic mythologies of the gods, the story of Osiris and Isis, of the death and resurrection of Osiris, of Ra's daily journey across the sky and his nightly battle against the serpent of chaos. These stories were repeated in oral tradition and were displayed on the walls of temples and in tombs. The peasant might not have understood all the theological subtleties that priests debated, but he understood the essential narratives. He understood that the gods controlled the world, that death was not the end, and that his actions in life would have consequences in the afterlife. Religion also provided structure to the peasant's year through festivals and holy days. There were numerous festivals celebrated throughout the year, some connected to the agricultural cycle, some to the birthdays of gods, some to other religious occasions. During festivals, the normal work schedule would be suspended or modified. The temples would distribute food, bread, meat from sacrificed animals, beer, to the people. There would be processions, music, and celebration. These festivals gave the peasant something to anticipate, a break in the relentless monotony of work, and a sense of participation in something larger than himself. The most important religious obligation for any Egyptian was to ensure that after death, his body would be properly cared for, and that his name would be remembered and spoken. The afterlife was understood to be a real place, and the living were understood to have obligations to the dead. A peasant would hope to be buried with at least some basic provisions, bread and beer, perhaps a simple amulet or two, perhaps a modest amount of linen to wrap the body. While the wealthy could afford elaborate tombs filled with treasures and populated with small statues of servants to work for them in the afterlife, the peasant's burial would be simpler. But even a simple burial, if performed properly, was better than no burial at all. The field of reeds, or Aru, as the Egyptians called it, was imagined as a place like Egypt itself, with fields that needed to be worked and harvested. But in the field of reeds, the work was not forced labor. The land was fertile and abundant. The work was pleasant, and there were no overlords exacting taxes or beating workers with whips. This vision of the afterlife, a continuation of earthly existence, but without the hardship and oppression, was enormously appealing to the peasant. It gave meaning to his life struggles. It offered hope that after a life of toil, there would be rest, there would be abundance, there would be peace. The world in which the Egyptian peasant lived was saturated with disease. The warm climate that supported agriculture also supported the development and spread of parasites and pathogens. The reliance on the Nile for water, while necessary for survival, exposed the population to waterborne diseases. The malnutrition that was almost universal among peasants made them more vulnerable to infection. The result was a population constantly under assault from illness and infection. Schistosomiasis, also known as bilharzia, was endemic in Egypt. This disease is caused by parasitic flatworms that spend part of their life cycle in freshwater snails and part in human hosts. A person becomes infected by exposure to contaminated water, by swimming, wading, or simply by having contaminated water splash on the skin. Once infected, the parasites settle in the blood vessels, where they cause damage and bleeding. Chronic infection leads to scarring of organs, anemia, and weakness. The disease is rarely immediately fatal, but it causes chronic suffering and reduces the ability to work. Malaria was also present, particularly in the delta regions where standing water in marshes and canals provided breeding grounds for mosquitoes. The parasite spreads through mosquito bites and causes periodic fevers that could be incapacitating. A peasant working through a malarial fever would be weakened and vulnerable, less able to do his work, more vulnerable to punishment if his productivity suffered. Guinea worm disease, spread through contaminated water, created internal parasites that eventually migrated through the skin, creating painful ulcers and disabilities. Dysentery and other intestinal parasites were common, causing chronic diarrhea, malnutrition, and weakness. Hookworms, pinworms, and roundworms infected the majority of the population. Beyond parasitic diseases, there were infectious diseases caused by bacteria and viruses. Pneumonia and other respiratory infections would have been common, particularly among children and the malnourished. Skin infections, eye infections, and ear infections were widespread. The warm climate created conditions favorable for rapid bacterial growth, and wounds could easily become infected. Dental disease was universal. The sand and small stones that contaminated bread and other foods wore away tooth enamel, and the high carbohydrate diet promoted tooth decay. The condition of peasants' teeth, visible in skeletal remains and in some mummified remains, was truly appalling by modern standards. Many would have had advanced tooth decay, gum disease, and abscess infections that would have caused constant pain. Medicine in ancient Egypt was a mixture of effective treatments and ineffective or even harmful ones. The Egyptians had some genuine pharmaceuticals. Willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, would have had pain-relieving properties similar to aspirin. Various herbs were used to treat digestive complaints and fever. Some treatments, based on empirical observation, actually worked. Others, based on magical thinking, would have had little effect. The most common and most serious illnesses had no effective treatment. A peasant struck down by malaria would be managed with fluids and perhaps herbal remedies that might reduce fever slightly, but would not cure the disease. He would be expected to recover on his own or to die. If he had a serious infection from a wound or from an abscess, there was little that could be done. Amputation was known, but was rarely performed, particularly on peasants, because a peasant without a limb could not work and was therefore considered disposable. Life expectancy was shockingly low. The average life expectancy for the peasant population was somewhere in the mid-30s, with studies of skeletal remains suggesting an average age at death of 32 to 35 years. This is not to say there that everyone died at this age. Some lived to be old, but many died young, and this brought down the average. Infant mortality was particularly horrific. Perhaps 30 to 40% of children died before reaching the age of 5. Many women died in childbirth or from complications of pregnancy. Many men were killed by accidents or disease in the course of their work. Those who did survive to old age would have been exceptional, having survived diseases that killed most of their childhood cohort and having endured decades of hard physical labor. An old peasant would typically be physically broken down, with missing teeth, damaged joints, possible hernias or other damage from years of heavy labor and chronic pain. Yet as long as he could move and had a mind still functioning, there would be work for him. The elderly did not retire. They continued working until they could work no more, at which point they would be supported by their children or would fade away into poverty and neglect. The Egyptian understanding of disease included concepts of medicine and magic mixed together. A fever might be treated with herbal remedies believed to have been endorsed by the god Thoth. An illness might be attributed to possession by a demon and addressed through magical exorcism. Many treatments that we would consider purely magical might have had placebo effects. The belief that a treatment would work could provide psychological comfort and might reduce stress, potentially improving the immune response. Despite having some genuine medical knowledge, Egyptian physicians were limited in what they could accomplish. Surgery was practiced, but it was extremely dangerous without anesthesia, antibiotics, or even proper understanding of germ theory. A serious wound was almost certainly a death sentence. A surgeon might splint a broken bone or set a dislocated joint, but infection from the injury would likely prove fatal. Pregnancy and childbirth were the most dangerous events in a woman's life. Many pregnancies would have ended in miscarriage, often due to the mother's poor health and malnutrition. Those pregnancies that went to term would result in delivery complicated by numerous factors. The mother's previous pregnancies might have damaged her body, making subsequent births more difficult. Infections could develop before, during, or after delivery. Hemorrhage could occur. The survival rate for childbirth was probably not as bad as in some periods of human history, but it was still catastrophic. A woman could expect to face a substantial risk of death every time she became pregnant. The peasant thus lived in a world of disease and constant physical discomfort. Pain from dental disease, from intestinal parasites, from chronic infections, from the accumulated damage of hard labor, was simply part of existence. The goal was not to be healthy, that was often impossible, but to stay functional enough to work, to survive another day, to perhaps survive long enough to see grandchildren born. The peasant existed at the bottom of a strictly hierarchical society. Above him were arranged the scribes and craftsmen, the soldiers, the priests, the nobles, the officials, the viziers, and at the very top, the pharaoh. There was little possibility of moving from one class to another. The social structure was understood to have been ordained by the gods, to be the natural and perfect order of the world. A peasant was a peasant, because that was his nature, because the gods had made him for that purpose. The relationship between the peasant and those above him was not one of equals negotiating. It was a relationship of power and obligation. The peasant owed labor and taxes to his superiors. In return, those superiors were theoretically supposed to provide protection and oversight, ensuring that the peasant had enough to survive. In practice, this could be a very one-sided relationship, with the peasant giving much and receiving little beyond the bare minimum necessary to keep him alive and functional. The land itself did not belong to the peasant. Even if a peasant worked the same plot of land his entire life, even if his father and grandfather had worked the same land, the peasant himself did not own it. The land belonged to the pharaoh, or to a noble, or to the priests of a temple. The peasant could be removed from the land. He could be assigned to work different land. He had no security of tenure, no legal protection beyond whatever custom or the goodwill of his owner provided. Taxes were collected multiple times per year, and the process of collection was invasive and threatening. Officials would come to the village, oversee the harvest, and extract what they determined the peasant owed. The amount owed was not fixed and not truly negotiable. The official would estimate the value of the peasant's land and the expected yield, determine what portion belonged to the state, and take it. If the peasant disputed the assessment, he had no recourse. He could not sue the official. He could not appeal to a higher authority. The official's determination was final. If a peasant could not meet his tax obligation, various punishments awaited him. He might be beaten. His family members might be taken as hostages until the debt was paid. He might be conscripted into debt labor, working until the value of his labor offset his debt. In extreme cases, a peasant or his family members might be sold into slavery to settle a debt. Yet despite these constraints and dangers, peasants occasionally rebelled or resisted. There are scattered records of peasants fleeing their villages to escape unbearable conditions. There are references to theft and to active resistance to tax collection. Some sources describe peasants being harsh with themselves and with their children to convince tax officials that they had nothing to give. These acts of resistance were dangerous. They could result in severe punishment. But the fact that they occurred at all suggests that the situation was sometimes unbearable enough that the risk was worth taking. Scribes served as the intermediaries between the peasant and the state. A scribe was responsible for recording what the peasant owed, for keeping track of tax payments, for determining whether the peasant's obligations had been met. A scribe with good humor might treat these duties with relative fairness. A scribe who was harsh or corrupt could make a peasant's life miserable. The survival of several instruction letters to scribes from their supervisors suggests that it was not uncommon for scribes to cheat the state or the peasants, to embezzle grain, or to engage in other forms of corruption. The peasants' relationship to the military and to military service was also complex. There was a standing army in Egypt, with soldiers who received regular training and rations. But in times of war or crisis, peasants could be conscripted into military service. A peasant army was less effective than a trained professional army, but it could be used for garrison duty, for siege warfare, or for other military tasks. A peasant conscripted as a soldier had little choice in the matter and faced serious consequences if he refused or deserted. Punishment for infractions of law and order was severe. A peasant who stole might have his hand cut off. A peasant who failed to pay taxes might be beaten or imprisoned. A peasant who assaulted another might be severely punished through physical violence administered by the state. The Egyptian legal system did recognize distinctions based on class. A peasant's punishment for the same crime would be more severe than a noble's, but there was a justice system in place that applied to all. Yet within the peasant community, there was also order and cooperation. Disputes between peasants were handled through local mechanisms. Elders or a local official might mediate disputes about water rights or about damage to property. The peasant village functioned as a community with shared interests and shared obligations. The peasants would gather collectively to perform work, village repair, collective harvesting, or other communal tasks. There was no privacy. Everyone knew the business of everyone else. There was mutual obligation. If one family's house burned, the others would contribute resources to help rebuild. If one family was facing starvation, others might provide food. The community was the peasant's survival mechanism, a buffer between the individual and the state's demands. The peasant's life was not entirely consumed by work and suffering. There were moments of joy, however brief and however rare. The festival calendar provided regular occasions when the normal work schedule was suspended and the peasant could engage in activities other than work. There were religious festivals, celebration of the Nile's flooding, festivals honoring various gods, festivals at harvest time. During festivals, the temples might distribute meat from sacrificed animals to the people. There would be music and dancing. Beer would flow more freely than usual. The atmosphere would be festive, celebratory. For a few days or a few hours, the peasant could step away from his normal existence and participate in something larger than his own survival. Music was deeply embedded in Egyptian culture and was present at many occasions. Professional musicians performed at festivals, at religious ceremonies, and at the homes of the wealthy. But music was not restricted to the wealthy. Peasants made music as well, using simple instruments. The harp and the lyre were sophisticated instruments, but there were simpler instruments too. The sistrum, a rattle that created a jingling sound, was popular and could be made simply. The lute was played, the drum, the flute. Musical performances might be accompanied by dancing, with performers moving rhythmically in response to the music. Dancing was a normal activity in peasant celebrations, and there is evidence that dancing was appreciated and enjoyed across all social classes. Games were played during festival times and during whatever spare time a peasant might have. Senet was a popular board game, played with pieces and a board marked with squares. The rules were complex and involved both chance and strategy. Games of a similar nature existed, Mehen, which was named after a serpent god, and involved pieces on a spiral board, though the rules are now lost. Simpler games like wrestling or games involving balls were popular with children and with adults as well. Entertainment also came in the form of stories and of oral literature. Talented storytellers would gather audiences and tell tales, stories of gods and heroes, of clever tricks and moral lessons, of family history and legendary events. These stories served both as entertainment and as a means of transmitting cultural values, religious beliefs, and practical knowledge. A good storyteller was valued and might attract audiences of dozens or even hundreds of people gathered in someone's yard or in a public space. Hunting and fishing, when they occurred, provided not only food, but also a form of recreation for those with the ability to engage in them. The Nile and its surrounding marshes were full of birds, geese, ducks, cranes, and others. Wealthier peasants and those with access to the river might set snares or hunt these birds. Fishing could similarly be both practical and recreational. A peasant might fish during his limited free time, both to provide food for his family and for the simple pleasure of engaging in an activity different from his normal labor. Drinking and social gathering were important aspects of peasant life. Beer was not consumed in moderation as a serious beverage for serious occasions. It was consumed socially, in groups, and consumption was often heavy. A peasant might attend a gathering where beer was served, sit with other men, and drink until he was quite drunk. This provided social bonding, a break from work, and a temporary escape from the difficulties of his life. The Egyptian legal system had rules about drunkenness, suggesting it was common enough to require regulation. Sexuality and romance were acknowledged as part of life. Love songs survived that expressed desires and emotions in quite explicit terms. Marriage was partly pragmatic, an alliance of families, a means of producing heirs, but affection between spouses was recognized and valued. Sexuality itself was not considered shameful or sinful. The gods themselves engaged in sexual relations, and this was not considered problematic. A peasant might have a sexual relationship with his wife, and extramarital sexuality was acknowledged, though its side was subject to social regulation and potential punishment. The peasant's relationship to humor and to laughter is harder to discern from the surviving evidence. Certainly, there were jokes and funny stories. The surviving literature includes humorous tales and clever insults. Satire and witty remarks are documented. But it is impossible to know how much humor or laughter characterized peasant life. How often a peasant might smile or laugh during his day. Bathing and cleanliness provided pleasure as well as practical benefit. Bathing in the Nile or in canals was a frequent practice for those with access to water, and it provided relief from the heat and the dust. The Egyptians' apparent obsession with cleanliness and with appearance suggests that the care of one's body provided satisfaction. Grooming, the application of oils and perfumes, the care of hair. These activities might not have been available to all peasants all the time, but when they were possible, they provided pleasure and a sense of dignity and self-care. Finally, the peasant could take pride in his work and in his family. A harvest brought in successfully, a field well tended, a child who survived to adulthood, a marriage that endured, grandchildren who promised to continue the line. These were real accomplishments. Within the constraints of his situation, the peasant could strive to do his work well, to raise his family with care and wisdom, to pass on his knowledge and values to his children. This meaning-making, this attempt to create value and permanence in a life that was generally harsh and often brief, was perhaps the most important pleasure available to him. Death was not the end. This was the fundamental belief that animated Egyptian religion and Egyptian society. A peasant would work, endure hardship, and accept his position in life partly because he believed that death would bring a transition to a better existence. The afterlife, the field of reeds, or Aru, was imagined as a place like Egypt itself, but without oppression, without hunger, without the arbitrary cruelty of landlords and officials. The peasant understood his death to be dangerous. His body had to be preserved and treated with care, or his soul would become lost and unable to reach the afterlife. The process of mummification was understood to preserve the body so that the soul could return to it and dwell there. The peasant knew that ideally he should be mummified as the pharaohs were mummified, but mummification was expensive, requiring specialized knowledge and materials. Most peasants would never receive the elaborate mummification reserved for the wealthy and the powerful. However, the Egyptian climate itself provided a solution. The hot, dry sand of the Egyptian desert naturally preserved bodies. When a peasant was buried in a grave dug in the desert sand, his body would desiccate and be preserved by the environment, achieving through natural processes what the wealthy achieved through elaborate techniques. This natural mummification was not perfect. It did not involve the careful removal of organs or the wrapping in treated linen that characterize formal mummification, but it preserved the essential form of the body sufficiently that the soul could recognize and inhabit it. The burial of a peasant would be relatively simple. The body would be washed, perhaps wrapped in linen, and placed in a grave. There might be a simple wooden coffin, or the body might be placed directly in the earth. There would be attempts to include grave goods, objects meant to accompany the dead into the afterlife. These might be very modest, a few pottery vessels containing food and drink, perhaps an amulet, perhaps a simple tool, perhaps a bead or a piece of jewelry. These items were not meant as comfort. The peasants certainly could not enjoy them in the modern sense, but as reminders of the peasant's life and identity, objects that would help the soul remember who it was. The peasant would hope to have his name inscribed somewhere, on his coffin, on a stone near his burial place, in the memory of his children. The speaking of one's name was believed to sustain the soul. A soul whose name was never spoken, who was forgotten, was in danger of ceasing to exist entirely. To be truly dead in the Egyptian sense was not simply to die physically, it was to be forgotten, to be erased from memory. The family's obligation to the deceased did not end with burial. Regular offerings would be made at the tomb or at the home. Food and drink left as sustenance for the soul. Prayers spoken to ensure that the deceased was remembered. A son had a particular obligation to care for his father's tomb and to make offerings, ensuring that his father's soul was cared for in the afterlife. This obligation sometimes extended for generations, though eventually the practice would fade as descendants grew distant from their ancestors. The peasant's belief in the judgment after death was a powerful constraint on behavior. When a peasant died, his soul would be weighed against the feather of truth. If the soul was heavy with sin, if the peasant had lied, stolen, murdered, or committed other wrongs, the heart would sink when weighed, and the soul would be devoured by a monster and would cease to exist. If the soul was light, if the peasant had lived morally, then the soul would pass into the field of reeds. This system of judgment applied equally to peasants and to pharaohs. Even the most powerful person in Egypt, even the pharaoh himself, could be found wanting in judgment and could face non-existence. This created a moral framework that operated outside the normal hierarchies of power. A peasant who followed the rules of Ma'at, truth, justice, order, could be justified in the afterlife regardless of his humble status in life. A pharaoh who committed wrongs could be condemned. In practice, the details of what happened after death were understood only vaguely by most peasants. The surviving texts about the afterlife, the Book of the Dead and similar documents, were prepared for the wealthy and represent the beliefs of the educated and the priestly class. The peasant's understanding of the afterlife would have been simpler, more based on oral tradition and folk beliefs than on complex theological writings that he could not read and likely could not afford. The peasant's primary motivation in his belief system was the simple hope that after a life of hardship and labor, there would be rest. In the field of reeds, the afterlife itself would be agricultural. The peasant would own his own plot of land, would work it, would harvest from it, and there would be abundance without oppression. No overseer would beat him. No official would extract taxes. The land would be fertile and would produce abundantly. The work would be necessary, but would not be grinding or oppressive. This vision of the afterlife may have been the only thing that allowed the peasant to endure his earthly existence. The idea that it would eventually end, that there would be eventual rest, that his soul would be preserved and cared for, that he would be remembered. These beliefs gave meaning to suffering that would otherwise be meaningless. They provided hope in a situation where hope was otherwise difficult to muster. The peasant's tomb might be very humble. Many peasants were buried in communal cemeteries, in graves dug in the desert sand with few possessions. Some wealthier peasants might have had small, simple tombs. The most successful peasants, those with some resources or status, might have had tombs with brief inscriptions, identifying the deceased and perhaps expressing hope for the afterlife. But regardless of the quality of the tomb, the peasant had the same hope, that his name would be remembered, that his soul would be judged fairly, and that he would find peace in whatever came after. we have walked through the life of the Egyptian peasant, from dawn to dusk, from birth to death, from the seasonal cycles of the Nile to the eternal cycles of the gods. What emerges is not a portrait of contentment or of satisfaction, but neither is it a portrait of pure victimhood or despair. The peasant was human, with all that humanity entails. He loved his family. He celebrated festivals. He told stories. He hoped. He feared. He worked endlessly and with little recognition or reward. The Egyptian civilization that we revere, the pyramids, the temples, the art, the writing, all the achievements that have survived into our modern world, was built on the backs of these peasants, millions of them. Their labor, over hundreds and thousands of years, created the monumental structures and the cultural achievements that define ancient Egypt. Yet their names are lost, their individual stories forgotten. We know about kings and queens and high priests, but the vast majority of those who did the actual work of building Egypt are invisible to us. They exist only as aggregates, as statistics in tax records, as anonymous workers in tomb paintings, as scattered skeletal remains in archaeological sites. It would be easy to dismiss the peasant's life as simply miserable, simply a story of oppression and suffering. But that would be incomplete. Yes, there was oppression. Yes, there was constant hardship. Yes, the peasant's life was constrained and difficult, limited in its possibilities, ending prematurely in disease and exhaustion. But within those constraints, the peasant made meaning. He worked not for himself alone, but for his family and his community. He participated in religious rituals and festivals. He contributed to the creation of something larger than himself. He passed on his knowledge and his values to his children. He hoped for a better afterlife, and that hope gave him the strength to endure. The Egyptian peasant's life was real and specific. It was not metaphorical. It was not a symbol or an abstraction. It was a life lived in a specific time and place, with specific challenges and specific joys. The heat of the day, the ache of muscles from labor, the taste of bread and beer, the smell of the Nile, the sound of music at festivals, the touch of a loved one. These were the actual experiences that made up that life. And when we look at the monuments of ancient Egypt, when we stand before the pyramids or walk through the temples, we might remember that these monuments were not built by machines or by magic. They were built by peasants, by men who worked under the sun, who suffered from hunger and disease, who experienced the full weight of human limitation and human mortality. They built these monuments not for themselves, but for their rulers, for their gods, for their civilization. And then they died, their names forgotten, their individual stories lost to time. Perhaps that is the most human thing about them. They endured, they worked, they loved, they hoped, and they died. And the world they built outlasted them, as monuments and as memory. Not their memory, perhaps, but the memory of what they created. In that, there is a kind of immortality, even if they themselves could not know it or benefit from it. The next time you see an image of an Egyptian pyramid or read about the temples of Egypt, remember the peasant. Remember that these achievements were not the products of genius or magic or divine intervention alone, but of human labor, human suffering, human determination. Remember that the peasant's life, for all its constraints and difficulties, was a life nonetheless, a life lived with purpose and hope, and the universal human desire to create something that would endure after death. The Egyptian peasant is gone now, 10,000 years or more into the past. His village is dust. His family has scattered into the mists of time. His name has been lost, but his work remains. The pyramids still stand. The temples still inspire awe. The civilization he built, he and millions like him, still shapes how we think about human achievement, human culture, and human possibility. In that sense, if in no other, he is immortal. He is remembered, even if his name is not.